Hey everyone, I'm Alex, and today on Big All Books, I'm going to be doing my March wrap-up. So March was a much better than average reading month for me, definitely because I had March break off, so it was such a luxury to have a week off that I could dedicate a lot of time towards reading. So that's why I read a bit more books than I usually do. I've got 11 books to talk about from this month, so I've decided to split this video up into two parts. In today's half of the wrap-up, we're going to be talking about the nonfiction that I read and all of the graphic novels. And then in part two, that is going to be about the novels that I read. So let's get to it. There is only one book that I had to read for school this month, and it was one of the final memoir options for one of my English classes, and that one was A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier by Ishmael Beah. And the title and the cover really give you a good glimpse of what's going to be happening in this book. It is about the civil war going on in Sierra Leone from the perspective of this 12-year-old boy who gets separated from his family, so he spends a long time trying to find them, and then he ultimately gets recruited and he joins an army. And what I didn't expect was the structure of this book is actually you spend very little time with him while he's actually a soldier, and really the first half of the book is him leading up to that point. So I found that the second half of this book was a lot stronger in material because he gets recruited as a soldier, but he also goes through the rehabilitation process, and he writes about how difficult it is for you to just become a part of regular everyday life after you have been militarized, but he also talks about how important it is. Since there are so many child soldiers in his country, he talks about how this process is so important to make these people feel like they can be a part of society again. So it was a pretty incredible read. He also talks about how he ended up going to New York and telling his story and sharing it with the world. So Ishmael Beah is clearly a natural-born storyteller, and this was a pretty powerful memoir. The other work of nonfiction that I read this month was a slim essay called The Hatred of Poetry by Ben Lerner. I decided to pick up this book because I was going to be teaching poetry for the first time with one of my English classes, so I was really thinking a lot about the subject, and this was such a good place to start to go for some inspiration, because most students, you tell them, we're going to be doing a poetry unit, and they will literally groan out loud, and I think that's not an uncommon reaction. A lot of people are really uncomfortable with poetry and claim not to like it. As Ben Lerner argues, even most poets and people who actively read a lot of poetry even don't like it sometimes. So he is investigating why this happens to be the case throughout this essay. One of the ideas is that poetry is always a failure. So people are very inspired when you set out to write a poem, but because we're so entrapped by language, you can never really truly express the pure feeling of inspiration that you had at the beginning. So a poem is kind of this like clunky representation. It's the best that you can do, but even then it's not good enough. It doesn't capture those amazing emotions. He also explores how difficult it is to be a contemporary poet when everyone expects your work to be very relevant and engaging with social issues, but yet it also needs to be universal and timeless, so it's really hard for contemporary poets to strike a balance that is viewed as effective by most people. I enjoyed the way that he inserted poems into this text in order to analyze and explore his thoughts, so you're going to see appearances by Marilyn Moore, Emily Dickinson, and Claudia Rankine, but there is also a really amazing passage where he just tears this one poem to shreds. It is The Tay Bridge Disaster by William McGonagall, who is a Scottish poet famed for being one of the worst poets of the English language, and that scene was like laugh out loud funny. My boyfriend thought I was crazy that I was like laughing reading about poetry, but it was truly great. He just talks about how most people don't always know how to define good poetry, but you definitely know bad poetry when you see it, because this poem about a train wreck is truly a train wreck in itself. So this was a really engaging essay. It gets you thinking a lot about poetry, and it actually made me want to read more poetry, not less. So this was a really cool essay. I ended up spending most of my March break reading graphic novels, which is pretty unusual for me, but I was just having so much fun reading them that I just didn't want to stop anytime soon. So I think it all started last month. I read Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, and I realized I hadn't read anything graphic in a while, so I thought, let's pick up something else. So then I gave My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris a try, and this book absolutely blew me away. Like, I loved this so much. So then I knew that graphic novels, I caught the fever, it was just going to be happening. But this book was just amazing. I mean, the artwork is so cool. It is structured kind of like a notebook of this cool girl who's like a monster creature detective. She's trying to figure out some things, mysterious happenings that have gone on in her building. I absolutely loved the story of this book and the artwork and the personality. I'm so excited that there's going to be a second volume coming up. And I did make a review video talking about this book in more detail, so if you are at all interested, please do check that one out. Really loved this book. As well, I also picked up Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Since I knew that I was getting really hyped about graphic novels, I thought it would be fun to pick up a book and kind of learn more about the medium. Scott McCloud is definitely successful at what he sets out to do. Not only did I learn a lot about comics, some of the history and what comics are like different places around the world, and what makes this medium truly unique, but it's also such a celebration of comics. Like, he clearly just knows the form so well, and he's got so many insights about comics. And it was also about art in general and how comics should be held up there as their own special, unique form of art. I think times have changed since when this first came out, since Scott is framing this as a defense of comics. Like, he is clearly trying to prove something with this book, since there were a lot of people at the time that didn't respect the medium and thought that comics were just for kids and weren't very serious. But I think that there has been a big shift in the culture, especially since the first few graphic novels that I was introduced to was because they were on the syllabi of my university courses. So clearly there's a lot of discussion going on in these academic institutions of comics and why they matter. So I went into this book already really on Scott's side, but I still did enjoy going through the journey. He draws himself as a narrator and just kind of takes you through all of these concepts that I thought could be kind of dry, but this book was actually a lot of fun and hard to put down. So highly recommend this one if you're looking to learn more about comics. I also spent most of the week working my way through Bone by Jeff Smith. I don't know if you can truly appreciate how massive this one-volume edition of the cartoon is, but it was truly large. I had to use a pillow at all times to keep from wounding myself while reading this, but it was so much fun and totally worth it. I had such an awesome time working my way through this all week. It's about these three cousins. They are called bone creatures, and they end up in this new village, and at first it's pretty small in scope and they're just kind of getting into mischief and it's these cute little charming stories, but then as the series goes along, the scale is definitely widened and it becomes this intense epic adventure quest kind of story. It's got some comparisons to Lord of the Rings and I can definitely see where that's coming from. It is a pretty intense storyline, but it's also just so charming at the same time. Like, I really grew to love a lot of the characters in Bone. Each of the three Bone cousins has their own well-developed personality. I really loved these rat creatures. They're supposed to be these scary, menacing villains, but at the same time, they're so goofy in a lot of ways, and they're like arguing about quiche. So there are just a lot of cool people populating this world, and it's a really awesome storyline, so I had such a fun time reading Bone. The last graphic novel that I got around to this month was Sandman Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes by Neil Gaiman. So this is a series of comics that, like, you just hear about so much that they're kind of like the gold standard, this really celebrated, dark, excellent series. And I decided to just bite the bullet, and I bought the entire series all at once. So there was a lot riding on this. I thought I really want to like this because it was not cheap to buy all of the issues of this. And I'm happy to say that this went really well for me. It is a super cool story, and I'm so intrigued after reading Volume 1 as to where the story is going to go, because I felt like Volume 1 was a very self-contained kind of story, where it's about this guy, Sandman, who has been imprisoned by humans for a very long time, and he escapes and basically has to get his tools back so that he can have his powers back. So it's kind of this like quest journey as he's going through these different struggles to get each object back, and then at the end it kind of wraps itself up. So I'm really wondering what he's going to go on to do next. There were quite a few characters introduced in this volume that I'm looking forward to meeting again, such as Cain and Abel, the famous biblical brothers. I thought had a really weird dynamic, and I loved the depiction of Death as this cool goth chick, so I'm excited to see what she's going to do in this series. And I also liked Lucifer as well, because there's clearly some weird bad blood between him and Sandman. I quite enjoyed that scene where he descends into hell. Gave me all the right kind of Dante, Inferno kind of vibes. So there are a lot of like intriguing episodes in this book. The freaking scene that is set in the diner that is like this like nightmare come to life is truly horrifying. One of the craziest things I've ever read before. The only thing I wasn't crazy about was when characters from the DC universe were kind of abruptly thrown into the story, but mainly that's because I haven't read a lot of comics, so I just didn't know who these people were or why I was supposed to care. But overall, I thought this was a really solid introduction to the series. I like the combination of having someone literary in charge of the storyline, and I know Neil Gaiman is going to take this to cool places since he's so interested in myths, but I also found the artwork to be quite compelling, and there were many times when I wanted to just stop, slow down, and see what was going on with the artwork, but again, the storyline kind of compelled me to keep pushing forward. So this was a great introduction to the series, and I know that I will be continuing on. Thanks for joining me for part 1 of my March wrap-up. Just talking about these graphic novels has made me want to reread all of them again, if only there were time. But if you have suggestions for some graphic novels that are kind of like the ones that I was talking about, I would love to hear that because I have really been having so much fun reading this genre. So thanks for watching part 1 with me, and hopefully I will see you in part 2, where I will talk about the novels that I read this month. Bye!